Okay, I think we can get started now. So again, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar about creating inclusive and accessible remote workplaces. Can I have the next slide, please? Great. So my name is Carla. I work on UN Global Compact Network UK's social sustainability and integrity projects and activities. And joining me today are Steve Kenzie, our Executive Director, and Kate Nash, who is the founder and CEO of PurpleSpace. Kate is the external advisor to GSK's Global Disability Council, strategic disability advisor to Post Office, disability advisor to Fujitsu, judge on Short Trust Power 100 list, and a member of the UK government's Ministers' Disability Confidence Business Leaders Group. And in 2007, Kate was awarded an OBE for services to disabled people. Kate has kindly agreed to deliver a presentation on this topic today and share some of her knowledge with us. So as companies around the world have turned to virtual workplaces and have sped up their digital transformation, it is key to ensure that these changes do not leave anyone behind. And this is particularly important for advancing the SDG or Global Goal 8, which focuses on decent work and economic growth, and on the SDG number 10, which focuses on reduced inequalities. So now more than ever, we feel that it is very important that different companies and organizations are as inclusive and accessible as possible. And this webinar in particular will try to shed some light on how this can be done by exploring best practices for disability inclusion in business during the COVID-19 crisis, but also beyond. And we will particularly focus today on how to support disabled colleagues working remotely and providing practical advice and tips for companies wishing to learn more and wishing to learn how to make their remote workplaces more inclusive and accessible. So our agenda today will start with an introduction to the company network. This will be led by Steve. And after that, we will move on to Kate's presentation about creating inclusive and accessible remote workplaces. And the last 15 to 20 minutes of today's webinar will be dedicated to a Q&A session, during which Kate will be answering any questions you may have. You can send in these questions anytime via the Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And you can also send in any questions, any other questions or any information about any technical difficulties you may be experiencing via the chat box, which should also be at the bottom of your screen. So as you can see, today we are also using PowerPoint's automatic captioning system to try to make this webinar just that little bit more accessible. And we will also share the recording and the transcript of the webinar with all of you next week, so that you can revisit it in 2 different formats. We are aware that some of you in attendance may have visual impairments or may be partially sighted. So we hope that this will help somewhat, but please do let us know if you need anything else in terms of accessibility. And if for some reasons you are having issues joining the audio via your computer, you can also join by phone via the dial-in details we sent you yesterday. So I will now hand it over to you, Steve, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Carla. There we go, a little difficulty with the slides. Thanks very much, Carla. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today, and particularly Kate. Just a few words on the UN Global Compact for those of you that might not already be familiar. It is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. It launched 20 years ago at the millennium when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General, and he had a vision that universal values might be a way to bring a human face to the global economy. And those universal values were encapsulated in the Global Compact's 10 principles. And these principles are drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And it gives us a rock solid foundation to project onto corporate sustainability policies, codes of conduct, really any activity happening in the world of business. These principles apply no matter how challenging the market might be. The human rights principles from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, yes, ratified by almost every country in the world. And so it's a very powerful statement for a company working in difficult markets to be able to point to this as the basis for their work. It is a membership, well, not quite a membership organization, but to join Global Compact does require a commitment. It comes from the CEO of your organization, and we ask them to commit to three key pieces. Firstly, to operationalize the Global Compact principles throughout the organization. Secondly, to report annually on the progress towards doing so. And finally, to support the wider UN development agenda. And at the moment, that development agenda is best represented by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Our role, the Global Compact Network UK, is to support companies towards that end. And we work together with our colleagues in 68 other local networks to achieve that, and along with our colleagues at headquarters. An upcoming example of that is our Leaders Summit that is going to be running Monday and Tuesday. It's going to start at 8 a.m. New York time and then follow the sun around the world, delivering continuous programming for 26 hours from every region as the sun passes through. It's a very exciting event. In addition to the Secretary General, we have our own Executive Director, Lisa Kingo. We have the Prime Minister of Germany, Angela Merkel, other heads of state, Mark Carney, Paul Polman, too many CEOs to mention. It's going to be, I think, one of the most unmissable corporate sustainability events of the year. There's a link at the bottom there. I urge you to have a look at the program and to register. Now, a little bit more on local networks. Here in the UK, there are 543 organizations participating in the Global Compact. 406 of these are businesses and another 137 non-business organizations. Our role, as I mentioned earlier, is to support companies with the commitments that they've made. So we have three main work streams: business and human rights, which this project sits within, the global goals, and climate action. And we have, well, in a normal year, we would do about 30 events. This year, we're probably going to crack 50 because we've been doing quite a lot more online than we would have done in normal times. We cover a very broad range of themes, working groups to go deeper into subjects, bigger conferences to raise awareness of some of the challenges that we're doing. Certainly be very interested in talking with any of you that would like to know more about getting involved with the network. Something that we've done just yesterday, a high-profile effort, we coordinated with our friends at UKSSD on a letter to the Prime Minister calling on him to put the Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of the UK's COVID-19 recovery plans. We had over 150 leaders sign on from that, from major corporations and civil society groups, academia, even the mayors of Bristol and Liverpool joined us. So a big success. So we're active in a wide range of areas, all focused on driving improvements in corporate performance on sustainability. With that, I am absolutely delighted to be handing over to Kate to tell us more about how we can create inclusive, accessible remote workspaces during these challenging times. Kate, over to you. I think you're muted.
Yeah, classic. It's going to be the expression of the age, I think. So firstly, Steve and Carla, huge thanks for the invitation to join you today. Getting to know you better day by day and deeply impressed with the work that you do. So it was a great delight to be invited and to be able to say yes to join you today. So thank you for that. In our short time together, and maybe let's move straight to the next slide, I'm going to try and cover off a number of topics in our session together. Just going to pause and see if Steve can get onto that second slide for us and share with you those things we're going to cover off. So after a very brief overview of PurpleSpace, what we do and why we do it, I'm going to tackle a number of topics. First of all, to share with you some of the things that we're seeing in terms of both the positive and negative aspects of working from home for disabled employees. As we know, it's been an extremely challenging time for all human beings in the UK and across the world. And yet, as human beings, we often choose in difficult moments to notice the things that we need to learn of ourselves, of our colleagues, of our loved ones, to try and make the world a better place. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that we're seeing across the PurpleSpace community around both the positive and the negative aspects of working from home. And then share some things that we're seeing in terms of our membership and how they're choosing to be much more inclusive and to deliver better for their disabled colleagues. And also that follows through in terms of many of their practices around customers, although I'll focus on colleagues. Share with you some top tips about what businesses can do to make working from home easier, and particularly as we see in different parts of the world, obviously a staged relaxation of the lockdown rules. I'm going to give some practical examples of good practice and then touch a little on what we're seeing around employee networks and resource groups and what this vehicle, what this wonderful community of network leaders in different types of businesses are doing to create a much more positive and life-affirming remote workplace. So in terms of who we are, very briefly, I know some of you will know us well, some of you may never have heard of us. So very briefly in terms of who we are and what we do. So our vision, our mission, our goals, and the return on the investment to those companies that choose to get involved. So our vision is of a world where disabled talent, purple talent, is routinely anticipated, expertly accommodated, and positively celebrated both by the UK and global employers. And we choose to deliver through our mission a unique digital worldwide hub for the professional development of disabled employee network leaders and resource group leaders. As we know, disability legislation often came 20 years later, depending where you're looking across the world, but often 20 years after, say, gender legislation, and certainly behind many other equalities legislations. So it's taken a wee while for businesses to notice the value, I suppose, of disabled employee networks. And what we choose to do is bring them together, share best practice, and support them to support their own members to bring their authentic selves to work. So our own goals is that every employer with over 500 employees has a disabled employee network, choosing to learn directly from their own people. Secondly, that every disabled employee network and resource group can access relevant, what we call networkology, the art and the science of delivering high-performing, high-performance employee networks. And lastly, that every disabled employee can access know-how in terms of how to build inner confidence and resilience. And that's really because, as we know, disabled people, although it's a very complex human experience and people will experience their disabilities, their impairments in very different ways, what we see as a golden truth, a purple truth that runs through those human experiences is that often it's something that they can derail them either for a short period of time or for a lifetime. So building inner confidence and resilience often goes hand in hand in building inclusive workplaces. And in terms of what our members get out of it, well, we see again and again that those companies who choose to adopt the networkology know-how, that the percentage of their workforce that share they have a disability or health condition increases. As we know, it can be incredibly hard to share that truth with your business, and some of the unintended consequences of sharing that you have a disability are very difficult for people to manage. But we do see that that number goes up over time. And again, secondly, engagement scores between disabled employees and the employer goes up. And lastly, we see that companies that choose to work with employee networks, that over time they make better decisions around policy, around practice and procedure, simply because they're learning directly from their own people. And then next slide, which I won't labour on. I mean, as I say, we do lots of know-how. You know, we've grown. We set up in 2015. We now have 600 members across 110 organisations, and our estimated reach is that of 440,000 disabled employees. Our flight path is significant. It already was pre-COVID. And we're now just supercharging our capacity to deliver across jurisdictions. And obviously our members get access to online materials, webinars, podcasts, publications, etc. We pride ourselves on being an innovation space, really to bring great people together who are doing, you know, they have proper jobs, dare I say it, for those people who work in HR and diversity inclusion, forgive me, but I hope you will humour me and know what I mean when I say these are individuals who are delivering what they need to do. So they can be policemen, they can be health workers, they can be researchers, they can be supermarket assistants, they can be all range of things. But what they have in common is that they want the world to be a better place, and they want to support their future selves, those individuals who might want to work with the business, to work for them and to support their business to do differently. So let's go, I think the next slide is just a few logos. As I say, we work with small local public sector organisations as well as large conglomerates and multinationals, so a real mixed blend. So let's go straight into, so what are we seeing across the PurpleSpace community in terms of the positive and the negative aspects of working from home, which of course has come in a supercharged way, sometimes quite a dramatic way. We didn't have too much notice. And of course that differs across the world. You know, certainly in the UK, we had a few days to get ourselves organised. We knew lockdown was coming. We knew when it was going to become a have to. And although that was difficult and uncomfortable for so many of us, although everybody has different jobs and our interaction with work varies and our relationship with work varies, there are some real truths coming through for those people who have a health condition, whether that be physical, whether that be mental health, whether that be being on the neurodiverse spectrum, etc., etc. So here are some common truths, and of course I caveat what I say in brackets on all of those. For some, this of course is themes, and it's not the case that everybody is experiencing these things. In terms of the positive, particularly those who may have mobility impairments and or pain and discomfort in terms of moving around, the working from home has meant that it has removed at a swoop the burden of travel and reduces the amount of what we would call the disability management time. Often that disability management time is unseen from the business, but of course it might include things like personal care needs, as well as travel needs, as well as doing things differently, as well as all of the often extra costs of getting to and from work. So at a swoosh, that has removed that burden, and we're hearing positive, good stories of how people are choosing to use that time, and often for their employer, interestingly. Secondly, we're seeing that a lot of people are enjoying a greater connection between teams. Of course, there is a downside, and we're all zoomed out, and you know, we're all learning as people how to create a better balance in terms of how we meet and how we work and how we interact, and we have to learn some good behaviours in terms of how we do that. But we're certainly seeing disabled people feeling better connected and less isolated. Thirdly, for some, it means a better setup. There is a caveat and there's a downside, which I'll come to. But for some disabled people, they've often had the best kit that they need in terms of IT personally. And so they're in their sweet spot, they're in their good place, they're in their setup where they feel most comfortable and most capable and have the highest capacity is when they're at home. Thirdly, we're seeing again and again how it has created a step change in how their employer is thinking about and responding to home working. There's lots of fingers crossed in the UK and across the world of disabled people now hoping very much so that some of the lessons learned over this period will not be switched back if there's too much of a speed by which people return to work, because we've seen a significant step change in how employers are thinking about the ways in which they can have efficiencies in the system by people working from home. And then two more, created what I would call a more blended way of life, pros and cons. I think in the first 4 weeks, we were all struggling to make sense of, how do we look after our loved ones? How do we set ourselves up? How do we look after children and grandparents and our partner? And it was all a struggle, but over time I think we've all learnt better ways in which we can blend our life. I heard someone the other day, I'm sure everybody's heard this expression, it's not so much that we're working from home as that we are now sleeping at the office, which I think is a good way of describing what's happening, and there's some pluses within that. And then lastly, people feeling more productive and more helpful. The helpful often is about disabled people who have experienced some very difficult challenges in their life. And although, in terms of where have I seen this before in terms of challenge, of course, none of us of human beings have experienced anything quite like this pandemic, and fingers crossed we never will again, although it is likely we'll have to manage this experience for a wee while yet. But that notion of having had challenges in one's past life means that sometimes disabled people are quicker to get to the nub of what you need to do as a human being to self-manage. And we hear again and again how disabled people have supported their non-disabled colleagues through very difficult times. The negative is often an enhanced and exaggerated version of what we're all feeling. Certainly the isolation has caused a lot of stress and anxiety, and in some case triggered experiences of depression. I think the general levels of uncertainty can remind people of past threats, I suppose, in CBT language, cognitive behavioural therapy. Quite often if we feel threatened and we feel we have a lack of control, that can trigger greater thoughts of depression and anxiety. We have seen that. In practical terms, a lot of people have not been able to access their usual workplace adjustments, and that's particularly the individuals who may have desk-based work, if they have an ergonomic chair, or they have a stand-up, sit-down desk, or they have particular kit and gizmos, a techie term, in terms of being able to use different interfaces in very dramatic ways. They've not been able to access that. And that said, the caveat is we have seen some remarkable examples of best practice where employers have chosen to rip up the rule book and do whatever is necessary to support that individual to get the kit that they need, including, for example, permission to purchase outside of existing procurement laws, an ability to buy things off online marketplaces quickly, even though they may not be a preferred supplier. And then two other negatives, I think, particularly in the early days, disabled people with mental health conditions, seeing their colleagues struggle, felt unable to ask for modified or extra adjustments. So seeing their business, depending on the trade of that business, either predict the economic downturn and didn't feel able to ask for things that are going to require an extra cost, or didn't want to ask people to do things differently within their company because they just felt like a burden. And then I suppose lastly, but I think particularly people who are on the neurodiverse spectrum, often different ways of working, particularly when you haven't had practice or a timeline to see things coming down the track. It can be quite difficult for you to learn quickly new ways of working. So we have seen lots of anxiety for those who experience neurodiverse conditions. So next slide, if I may, Steve. I'm going to now share with you some common truths that we're seeing. It is necessarily high level, and it's high level because, of course, we all come in different shapes and sizes. Disability is a term, it's a phrase. While enshrined in legislation, it does refer to a human experience that impacts people at different points of their life and in different ways. So this is necessarily high level. So I hope you'll be able to read into some of this, although I've got some practical examples later on. Very easily, we're seeing employers simply encouraging their employees to be themselves, and recognising this need for people to be kind to themselves. This wonderful expression that the perfect is the enemy of the good enough. And I think what I mean by that is great leaders who choose deliberately to share their corporate values of trust, of inclusion, of welcoming diversity, is helping people to see that that means different things for different people. And as we know, in terms of disability, you know, the old doctrine of equal opportunities of the past, which meant you have to treat everybody the same. That's not the same with disability. And often, to treat people fairly, you have to treat people differently. So great leadership in terms of encouraging people to be who they are. Secondly, in terms of good practice, making it okay to talk about feelings. We're seeing some great senior business leaders who are choosing to crank up and supercharge, I suppose, their own style of leadership by sharing personal stories of how they found it hard to look after loved ones, whether that be relatives or elderly parents, talking specifically about maybe their own children and how they may be struggling. And by doing so, they're making it easier for people to talk and share about these very difficult things. And simply talking about it can often mean that you can leave that behind because it's not haunting you. And then I think significantly, many business leaders are now choosing to invite specific feedback from disabled employees. A lot of disabled people are, as we all know, you either those are having to shield because they are classed as vulnerable. It's not a language that many disabled people enjoy, many preferring to use the language of susceptible. But of course, there is a good chunk of community of individuals who do work, but life is very different for them because they are being forced to shield. And then there's a whole raft of other people who may have a condition which means that they are not, in terms of the government definitions, vulnerable, such as myself, rheumatoid arthritis, etc. But nonetheless, because they have experienced things that might suggest that COVID has impacted them differently, it means that they have to notice that it's going to take a wee while before they get back to work. So now, again, we're seeing business leaders choosing deliberately to invite specific feedback from disabled employees as they draw up their plans in terms of easing up of lockdown. And then lastly, making it okay to have difficult conversations. I've shared a little bit about being very specific about what the workplace adjustment is, how you can access it, what is available, and then having fresh messages on intranet sites that says that we're prepared to rip up the rule book. I'm exaggerating, but only for effect here. We have seen a lot of companies who are choosing, as I say, to allow people the freedom to purchase the kit that they need. And then lastly, insisting, I suppose, that everybody within an organisation that heads up a people team is that you routinely add to your team calls, how are people doing? That simple, seemingly soft question at the end of a team meet is reaping great rewards to help people to share information. On the next slide, and hope I'm doing okay for time. I'll just have a quick time check. Okay, yeah.
That's absolutely fine, Kate. You just go on.
So in terms of practical things that businesses can do to be more inclusive and to make working from home easier, I think the first is to only use tech that will offer a fully inclusive experience. So, you know, without naming names and different tech, I'm sure all of us are completely now all fake. I mean, if I'm going to use all of them, I'll just mention some of them. You know, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, etc. We're seeing now although there are some companies who have always, or suppliers I should say, who have done an incredibly good job of routinizing the way in which individuals can access tech. There are others now that are choosing to really crank that up and now to make it freely available. And that now is being matched by businesses who are noticing that to be really inclusive, both for their employees as well as their customers, they're now choosing to use only tech that will do that for them, even if that means a financial burden to the business, which is fascinating. Secondly, ensuring that the leadership team is setting the bar high in acknowledging that challenges exist. As we know, 83% of all disabled people, not just in the UK, but globally, are individuals who acquire that human condition through the course of their working life. So anything from 16 up to, well, we never retire now. So, but it's through the course of our working life. And therefore, and yet we know that often when businesses monitor, they'll often come back saying, well, we only have 1% or 2% or 3% of our people. But we know that all organisations of any shape, of any size, of any trade and any geography will have between 10 and 12% of their people will have a disability or a health condition as defined by the legislation. So leadership teams who are really setting the bar high, knowing that they can, even though science and data and metrics are important to them, they're choosing to ignore what the supposed official data says, 1, 2, 3%, and notice that 10% of their people are likely to experience disability or ill health. Thirdly, what else can they do practically? As I say, making sure that in every single team meet, from 2 upwards numbers of people, to review that process. Just a soft question at the end: is this working for you? Is there anything I can do differently or better as your colleague? Is there anything I can do personally differently or better as your line manager? Or anything that I can do as a senior business leader to make sure that this working from home is inclusive for you? And then, of course, the chief executive modelling those behaviours and or leading the march. And then 2 other specifics: making sure that the existing workplace adjustment policy that would have been created pre-COVID, it'll be there somewhere in your system, but to allow somebody the freedom to operate, to make sure that everybody knows it is, of course, subject to adaptation. And then, as I say, lastly, we're seeing a greater emphasis now as the lockdown easing comes into play, employers working hard and fast to notice what that means for their individuals, and being very specific from disabled employees about what they need. And then on that last slide, let me just give you some real concrete examples of different businesses. So one example would be a large global multinational IT company who has given express permission for people to organise their days. Now that may seem seemingly simple, and those companies who are very used to agile working and have very well-known, well-loved, well-used flexible workplace policies, that may seem seemingly silly, but it's fascinating how this particular company has made it incredibly clear that they expect people to organise their own days. So gone are the days where you have to ask permission, for example, to go out for a walk at 4 o'clock. You're not expected to ask permission. You have to do things to preserve and protect your emotional good health, in the knowledge that you can then deliver better for the business. So it's a really fascinating example. Second example would be an NHS trust, who of course has people at the centre and at its core, and has been incredibly challenged, of course, through COVID. And what they chose to do is to adapt one of their core values to flag the value of greater team sharing. So a greater number of their people, for example, their own disabled employees, whether they are nurses, whether they are on the front line, or whether they were administrators, some were shielding and some were self-isolating. And that what they have done is ask those individuals to share their hints and tips so they can bring them back into the NHS Foundation Trust and build on them. And then two other examples, which I love. One is a supermarket chain who has ditched a traditional video call provider in order to use another. It was just nowhere to hide. And they were off their books, and they secured another one at significant cost, in the knowledge, simply because the chief executive had dropped in to a resource group meeting and could see people struggling. And then lastly, a global retail bank, within 3 weeks, had trained thousands of their staff to better take account of distressed and vulnerable customers. And in so doing, they chose to deliberately consult with their own resource group in order to ensure that that particular provider of training was taking account of the particular and in lifetime experiences of disabled people. So I'll probably close there. I know we have another slide, and we will make this available. This is a very busy slide, and it's a slide that is on the internet. It's simply about who do we choose to be. And it's a slide which really helps us to see how, as individuals, we can either choose to stay in the fear zone, we can either choose deliberately to work within a learning zone, who do I want to be as a human being at this time, and again in a growth zone, individuals with their creative employers starting to notice the positivity within this, because there has to be, there absolutely has to be. So I'm going to close there. I've got some thoughts around ERGs, but I can weave them into questions, no doubt. So Steve, shall I go back to you, or Carla, you might have some questions?
Yeah, thank you, Kate, very much for the presentation. That was, I think, very insightful. We have one question in the question and answer box so far, so I'd just like to encourage everyone in the attendance to ask anything they might be interested in, and then Kate can comment on your questions. So if that's fine with you, Kate, I'll just read out this comment we got from Essie. So unfortunately, a negative for disabled people in this time, as Kate said, is lack of control over what is happening, but also in the workplace for many disabled people, it is a chance to get out of isolation. Therefore, working from home compounds that isolation. I think that's probably applicable to both disabled and some non-disabled people at this time. So would love to hear your thoughts on that, Kate.
Yes, absolutely. I think, you know, it's one of those moments in time in history where we have to deliberately, I think, choose to look inwards and think about who we want to be as an individual and as a worker. And, you know, one of the things that the pandemic has done, as obviously meant that we've have to be quite isolated from our loved ones, from our colleagues, sometimes from our partners, certainly from parents, etc. And of course, for health workers, many have had to be away from their children. And I think that isolation is universal. You know, of course, all of us are experiencing that. And I think, you know, certainly within the PurpleSpace community, although certainly in the very early days, I think many disabled people felt acutely alone because they were having to scenario scan, how am I going to get food? If I can't do my online shopping, I have to be ready and available to click the link when it becomes live, you know, whatever supermarket it was. And therefore I can't work because I've got to keep my eye on when this online shopping store. So because there was no choice, you know, you couldn't queue up physically, etc. So I think now, however, we're seeing a greater shared experience. We see imaginative, amazing line managers who want to notice what they can do differently and better to support their workers. But equally, as things settle, again, I think a lot of disabled people are noticing the things that they can do to support others through this period of anxiety.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate, for that answer. We have another question from Sarah Brown-Fraser, who has actually collaborated with us on inclusive communications before and is an expert on that topic. So Sarah's question is, we as disabled people always need allies. Very topical, I know, especially now. would you encourage non-disabled people to work within the ERGs and in other places? Maybe we can go back to the previous slide just to complement this question.
Yes, good idea, Carla. That last slide around ERGs. So the short answer, Sarah, is absolutely. We very much enjoy the language of allies and champions. I mean, particularly the language of allies has been so skillfully used by our BAME and LGBT colleagues and citizens around the world. And as we know, never been a greater and more important moment in time for us to recognise the role and the value and the necessity for allies to step up and to be counted. So in terms of disability, yeah, we always recommend that businesses set up what we would call inclusive ERGs or networks. I think gone are the days where it's right to set up exclusive networks of just of disabled people. I think there is a case that sometimes we do learn about ourselves and who we are and how we ought to better lean into our career, and where we have inadvertently, I think, accepted what I would call the soft bigotry of low expectation, and therefore we have to choose how to modify our own behaviours as disabled people. There's an absolute case for that, and sometimes we can only do that through talking to our contemporaries. But there is a clear case for the role and support of our allies and champions, and we see through the networks do that time and time again. And it can often be the trigger for sustained and rapid change, rather than just keep saying the same thing. Yeah, great question, Sarah. Totally agree. That was the short answer.
Thank you very much for that, Kate.
Yes, can I
go ahead.
ask a question? I'm just thinking about invisible disabilities, and so many, like mental health, not always obvious, many other disabilities not always obvious. Some of your points seemed like, I guess, how do you address that idea that it's relatively easier to support people who are more transparent about their disability? And I would understand why someone might be hesitant to be transparent about this. And is it more necessary to be like blanket policies to be sure to catch everyone, even if they are uncomfortable with being more open about it?
There's different ways. I mean, we see, I often say that we see many different types of network as there are organisations. There's no one sort of silver bullet in terms of a governance structure that will do better than another. So to answer your question, Steve, we often talk about those people with hidden impairments or invisible impairments. And as you refer to, those people who experience mental ill health would be individuals who experience often that invisible impairment. And for them, they might seemingly feel that they have a choice in whether they choose to share that information or not, often called declaration or disclosure. I'm not a fan of that language. I think that creates an own goal. But we often talk about sharing personal information about disability and ill health. And, although there has been huge strides within businesses and externally through the Mind campaign, through some of the work of the This Is Me campaign, and although I think, truth be told, I think it's fair to say we are living in a world where there is a greater and more tolerant understanding about what it means to experience mental ill health. I think nonetheless, it would be wrong to suggest that any human experience is worse or more difficult than the other. So we see, so to come back, so we see networks that are inclusive of people with physical impairments as well as neurodiverse, as well as mental ill health. But we then see also other organisations to choose different governing instruments to support people. So you may have a specific mental health network, and I'll use a public example, it's not commercially sensitive because they are out and loud and proud. So for example, EY, the professional services firm, has a fantastic network And then they have specific impairment-specific networks. They have one for people with mental health, some people with dyslexia, people with visual impairments. So yeah, I think all of these experiences affect us differently, although there are some common truths. Let me, as we get another question come through, let me just talk lastly to this slide. So Carla asked me to just offer up what are we seeing in terms of the role of networks and ERGs in terms of creating positive remote workplaces, and we see 4 trends emerging. One is those networks are those network leaders are making the time to encourage storytelling between disabled employees. I could easily have added there our allies and champions, again some great rich examples of business leaders who are choosing to share their own story of struggle, you know, whether they are recasting the business, whether they are predicting a hugely difficult year, 2 years, 3 years in terms of the economy, and choosing deliberately to share what personal stress that is on them. It's just incredible, and that's just making it easier for people to notice our human frailty. The role of allies and champions and being very specific, again, some great examples, but I think particularly from the LGBT plus community, who have so skillfully used that concept of allies to help individuals within an organisation notice at a practical level, at a very, you know, with such granularity, what it means to be an ally, which is often more about choosing to use a particular coloured lanyard, but it's much more than that, and it's actually signing up and being counted. And then secondly, we see ERGs who are being asked to partner with specific parts of the business that need help. So I chose to share with you maybe the big large retail bank that was choosing to retrain all of its call centre staff to help customers who may be classed as vulnerable. So different parts of the business looking at their own people to help them to get better at delivering to customers. And then lastly, again, as we ease up on the lockdown, networks are increasingly being asked to feed into the executive level plans over the next few years. And again, it's a comment on the value of those networks who have delivered over time.
Thank you for that, Kate. We've just received a new comment while you were presenting. So we got a comment from Graham. So people with non-visible impairment conditions who haven't previously shared this information might be forced into by the new working conditions. If the organization isn't geared up for open conversations, hassle-free provision of adjustments, then for those people could be placed at a disadvantage. I think this ties in quite well with what you were saying about storytelling and how employers should encourage their disabled employees and really employees at large to share their stories and share their experiences. So it would be great to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a great and very helpful question. You're absolutely right. We are seeing individuals who have had a pre-existing condition who have, for different reasons, have not ever had to share that information with the business, and or have chosen to create what we call their own workaround. What I mean by that is somebody who, as an employee, whose life would be made perhaps a little bit easier and they could deliver better and really yield their capability and their production through the simple securing of a workplace adjustment. That could be anything from, say, an ergonomic mouse for somebody who has RSI. It might be a simple footstool for somebody who's acquiring a lower back condition and is just too scared to share that information with their colleague or occupational health or their line manager. And so, you know, and yet with COVID, sometimes these things come to the fore and people have no choice. Again, particularly those people who may have experienced cancer in the past or are on dialysis or who are not going to be able to move into offices anytime soon. So having the courage, and I use that language quite deliberately, having the courage, I think, to notice that fear, that inner fear is important, I think what I would offer up is, although these things are very difficult to reconcile with ourselves, and disability and ill health is often about accepting a life trajectory that, if pushed, we'd prefer not to have. And yet, you know, if we're able to offer something of ourselves, what we call bring your authentic selves to work, it's often a life affirmative moment. We have never come across a business that is deliberately, I don't know, creating a hit list of people to get rid of if there is a downsizing. We see plenty of examples of employers who do a pretty daft job of making sure that they specifically consult with disabled people and therefore inadvertently exclude. Plenty of those examples. But I have been a long time on this planet, and I still choose deliberately to say that I have never yet come across any human being who chooses deliberately to exclude me. So what I would say to that person is to notice that the language of workplace adjustments is enshrined in law. Adjustments are not favours. You know, we are way past the day where we see maternity leave cover as a favour. It would be simply ludicrous for us to think that thought anymore. But of course, disability is often a life experience where we have a change of identity, and it's not of choice. It's something that happens to us. So my advice would be, and I know Carla is making available the link to a book that I wrote some years ago called Secrets and Big News. And that book offers 5 provocations, 15 big ideas for employers to try, and 15 big ideas for people who have disability or ill health. And I'd encourage you to read that, not to be overly fearful. It would never be my advice to choose to encourage people to share that, but I would encourage you to notice the value and the positive impact of doing that over time.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, just on that note, we have sent the link to Kate's book to everyone yesterday, so you should be able to access it freely. But we will also follow up with more information on that next week, along with the recording of this webinar. So if I can just ask one last question, Kate. So you mentioned that inclusive tech is especially important in these times, and as an organization, we are always trying to get more inclusive tech in our day-to-day operations. So is there any particular tech that you have found useful lately, or that PurpleSpace has found useful in these times, that maybe isn't as well known?
Wow, so many examples, Carla, and I'll probably be shot if I mention a few and not others. And I do have to be cautious in terms of suggesting that I prefer certain suppliers. However, I love your question and I'm not going to ditch it. There is an organisation we work for called Microlink, and Microlink have been very generously supporting employers to notice all of the ways in which existing kit have been modified, some of the great suppliers, and are very able to advise companies if they want to hear what's best in class. So my advice would be, and again we can give you the link, Carla, to a company called Microlink, and they do give lots of free advice and support about best in class tech. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Thank you, Kate. I'll just let you wrap up, and then we can move on to the last slide of the presentation.
Brilliant. Well, I think I'm done. I mean, I think the only thing I would say is, again, to applaud you for putting the spotlight on this issue. Very much notice and enjoy the work that you do and the leadership that you take to support businesses to deliver against those sustainability goals. This topic, of course, fits squarely within your 10 principles. And yeah, I applaud you. So for those listeners, you know, if there's anything we can do to support you on your journey, then you've got it. We're happy to do that. If, of course, you'd like to come back and us to do a reflection piece in a year's time, etc., be very happy to do that. But yeah, thank you for your energy, your commitment, your interest and your passion. It's lovely to join you today.
Thank you, Kate. It has been an absolute pleasure for us to have you on here today. And I'll just maybe let Steve add a few last words.
Well, yeah, to echo, Kate, it's been a real pleasure, very informative. This is all really tremendously helpful to me as a leader of a small organization, and it's really opening my eyes to so many things that really needed eye-opening for. Thank you all to everyone that joined us today. We appreciate your attention and your time. We hope you found it worthwhile. As Carla said, we will be sharing the slides, and we have a recording. We can connect you, forward your questions on to Kate if you didn't catch her contact details, and we look forward to working with you all again in the future. So thanks again, Kate. Thank you, Carla, for organizing, and I wish everyone a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.